There is a pain that no medicine can treat, no therapy can fully resolve, and no amount of time can completely erase. It is the pain of losing someone you love, not the pain of a broken bone or a torn muscle, which the body knows how to repair, not the pain of a failed project or a lost opportunity, which the mind knows how to rationalize, but the pain of absence, the specific, unmistakable, physiologically devastating experience of reaching for someone who is no longer there. The empty chair at the table, the silence where a voice used to be, the phantom weight of a hand that will never again hold yours. This pain is grief, and it is one of the most powerful, most universal, and most poorly understood experiences in human life. Grief is not a disease to be cured. It is not a problem to be solved. It is not a weakness to be overcome. It is the price of love, the cost that consciousness pays for the capacity to form bonds so deep that their severance feels like the tearing of the fabric of reality itself. And in a sense that is more than metaphorical, as this investigation will show, that is exactly what it is. The loss of someone you love is not merely an emotional event. It is a physical event, a disruption of the quantum correlations that connected your consciousness to theirs, a rearrangement of the entanglement structure that bound your neural states to their neural states, a change in the geometry of the conscious landscape that you and the person you loved jointly inhabited. This investigation is the most personal we have ever conducted. It is about what happens physically, neurologically, informationally, and spiritually when someone you love dies. And it is about whether the connection that love created survives the death that appears to destroy it. Let us begin with what the neuroscience tells us about what grief does to the brain. Because the brain in grief is not merely sad. It is in crisis a crisis that reveals, with devastating clarity, how deeply the brain builds another person into the architecture of its own functioning. In 2008, the psychologist Mary Frances O'Connor at the University of California, Los Angeles, published a landmark study using fMRI to examine the brains of women who had recently lost a mother or a sister to breast cancer. O'Connor found that the brains of grieving women showed a distinctive pattern of activation that was unlike ordinary sadness, unlike depression, and unlike any other emotional state that neuroscience had previously documented. The most striking finding was the activation of the nucleus accumbens, the brain's primary reward center, the region associated with craving, desire, and the anticipation of pleasure. The nucleus accumbens is the region that lights up when an addict sees their drug, when a hungry person smells food, when a lover sees the face of their beloved. It is not an emotion center. It is a motivation center, the center that drives the organism to seek, to reach, to pursue the thing it needs. And in the grieving brain, the nucleus accumbens was active. The brain was seeking. It was reaching for the person who had died. It was generating the same motivational drive that it generates when it wants something desperately and cannot have it. O'Connor later distinguished between two forms of grief that have different neural signatures. Ordinary grief, which most people experience and which gradually resolves over months or years, involves the nucleus accumbens activation, but also shows progressive changes in the prefrontal cortex, changes that indicate the brain is slowly updating its model, gradually learning that the lost person will not return, reluctantly but steadily rewiring the circuits that expected their presence. The brain is adapting. It is painful, but it is working. Complicated grief, the prolonged, debilitating form that affects approximately 10 to 15% of bereaved people and that can persist for years without resolution, shows a different pattern. In complicated grief, the nucleus accumbens activation does not diminish over time. The brain does not update its model. The seeking behavior persists at full intensity, month after month, year after year. The brain is locked in the search, unable to accept the absence, unable to rewire, unable to let go of the neural representation that expects the person to still be there. The difference between ordinary grief and complicated grief is, in neuroscientific terms, the difference between a brain that is gradually decoherent, that is slowly accepting the classical reality of the absence, and a brain that is resisting decoherence, that is maintaining the quantum coherence of the bond against the overwhelming pressure of the sensory evidence. The brain in complicated grief is holding on to the connection with a tenacity that defies the classical description. It is refusing to update. It is refusing to accept the absence as final. And the question that physics raises, the question that this investigation will pursue, is whether the brain in complicated grief is delusional or perceptive. Is it clinging to an illusion? Or is it perceiving something real, a connection that persists beneath the decoherent surface, a bond that the sensory channels can no longer detect, but that the deeper circuits of the brain can still feel? O'Connor's finding reframed grief from an emotion to a drive. Grief is not merely the feeling of sadness that accompanies loss. It is the brain's desperate, biologically driven, neurochemically powered search for a person who no longer exists in the physical world. The brain has built the lost person into its reward circuitry. It has wired itself to expect their presence, to anticipate their voice, to seek their touch. And when the person dies, the brain does not immediately update its wiring. It continues to seek. It continues to reach. It continues to activate the nucleus accumbens every time a memory is triggered, every time a familiar scent is encountered, every time the brain expects the person to be there and finds, again and again, that they are not. The researcher Holly Prygerson at Weill Cornell Medicine has documented that the grief response persists, in attenuated form, for far longer than most people expect. The acute phase of grief, the overwhelming, disabling, all-consuming phase, typically lasts 6 to 12 months. But the neural changes persist for years. The brain's prediction models continue to generate expectations of the lost person long after the conscious mind has accepted the death. You walk into a room and, for a fraction of a second, expect to see them. You hear a sound, and before conscious processing catches up, your brain has already classified it as their voice. The predictions are automatic, preconscious, and deeply wired. They diminish over time, but they never fully disappear. The brain does not delete the person. It reclassifies them from present to absent but remembered, from expected to missed. But the neural representation persists, and with it, the capacity for the waves of grief to return, years or decades later, triggered by a scent, a song, a date, or a dream. This is why grief comes in waves. The brain is not continuously sad. It is continuously searching. And each wave of grief is a moment when the search encounters the absence, when the nucleus accumbens generates the seeking behavior, and the absence delivers the devastating feedback that the thing being sought will never be found. The wave is not an emotion rising and falling. It is a search failing, again and again, as the brain slowly, reluctantly, and incompletely learns that the person it is wired to seek is no longer available to be found. The parallel to addiction withdrawal is not a metaphor. It is a neurological fact. The neurochemistry of deep attachment involves the same circuits and the same neurotransmitters as the neurochemistry of addiction. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, is released during close physical contact with the loved person. Dopamine, the reward neurotransmitter, is released in anticipation of their presence. Endorphins, the brain's natural opioids, are released during intimate connection. When the loved person dies, all of these neurochemical supplies are abruptly terminated. The brain is in withdrawal, withdrawal from oxytocin, from dopamine, from endorphins, from the entire neurochemical environment that the relationship sustained. The physical symptoms of grief, the insomnia, the appetite loss, the fatigue, the chest pain, the difficulty concentrating are withdrawal symptoms, as real and as biologically grounded as the withdrawal symptoms of any addictive substance. The most dramatic evidence for the physiological reality of grief comes from broken heart syndrome, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, a condition in which the sudden loss of a loved person causes the heart to physically deform. The left ventricle balloons outward, the heart muscle weakens, and the patient experiences symptoms that are indistinguishable from a heart attack: chest pain, shortness of breath, collapse. In extreme cases, the condition is fatal. People die of broken hearts. This is not a figure of speech. It is a documented medical condition, first described in Japan in 1990 and now recognized worldwide, in which the grief of loss produces a surge of stress hormones so intense that the heart itself changes shape. The heart that breaks in Takotsubo is not breaking metaphorically. It is breaking physically, deforming under the stress of a neurochemical cascade that the loss of the attachment bond triggers. The body is not designed to lose its deepest connections without consequence. The circuits that sustain the bond were not peripheral luxuries. They were woven into the core of the organism's physiology, regulating the heart, the immune system, the hormonal balance, the sleep cycle, the appetite, and the basic will to live. When the bond is severed, the entire system is destabilized. The grief is not in your head. It is in your heart, your gut, your immune system, your bones. The neuroscientist Zoe Donaldson at the University of Colorado Boulder has studied the neuroscience of pair bonding and loss in prairie voles, one of the few mammalian species that form lifelong pair bonds. When a bonded prairie vole is separated from its partner, the vole shows behavioral changes that are strikingly similar to human grief: social withdrawal, decreased appetite, increased stress hormones, and a persistent repetitive search behavior in which the vole returns again and again to the places where its partner used to be. Donaldson's research has shown that these behaviors are driven by the same nucleus accumbens circuitry that O'Connor identified in grieving humans, confirming that the grief response is not a cultural construction or a psychological choice, but a deep, evolutionarily conserved, neurobiologically hardwired response to the loss of an attachment bond. Donaldson's prairie vole research revealed one more finding that is critical for our investigation. The bonded vole that loses its partner does not merely grieve, it changes. Its dopamine system is permanently altered. Its stress response is permanently elevated. Its social behavior is permanently modified. The loss is not a temporary perturbation that the system recovers from. It is a permanent restructuring of the organism's neurobiology. The bond changed the vole. The loss of the bond changed it again. And the vole after loss is not the same vole as the vole before loss. It is a different organism, different neurochemistry, different behavior, different baseline. The bond was not something the vole had, it was something the vole was. And the loss of the bond was not the loss of something the vole possessed. It was the loss of something the vole was made of. The same is true for humans. The neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA has shown that social loss activates the same brain regions as physical pain: the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. The brain processes the loss of a loved person through the same neural circuits that process a broken bone or a knife wound. Social pain is physical pain. The brain does not distinguish between them. And the reason it does not distinguish is that the social bond is as physically real as a bone. It is wired into the brain's architecture with the same structural integrity as a skeletal connection, and when it breaks, the break is as real, as physical, and as painful as any physical injury. The phantom limb phenomenon provides a further illumination of what grief does to the brain. When a limb is amputated, the brain's body map, the somatosensory cortex's representation of the body, does not immediately update. The brain continues to maintain a representation of the missing limb. The patient feels the limb that is no longer there, feels it move, feels it itch, sometimes feels it in excruciating pain. The brain has built the limb into its map of reality so deeply that the removal of the physical limb does not remove the neural representation. The ghost of the limb persists in the brain's architecture, generating phantom sensations from a body part that no longer exists. Grief is a phantom limb of the soul. The brain has built the loved person into its map of reality, into its reward circuitry, its emotional regulation systems, its prediction models, its sense of identity and purpose. The person was not merely someone you knew, they were part of your neural architecture. They were wired into the circuits that regulate your emotions, that predict your future, that define who you are. And when they die, the neural representation does not die with them. The brain continues to maintain the map. It continues to expect the person. It continues to generate the seeking behavior, the anticipatory activation, the phantom presence of someone who is no longer physically there. The ghost persists, and the pain of grief is the pain of the mismatch between the brain's map and the world's territory. The agonizing discrepancy between the neural representation that says they are here and the physical reality that says they are gone. The implications for personal identity are profound. If the brain builds the loved person into its functional architecture, into the circuits that regulate emotion, predict the future, and define the self, then the loved person is, in a precise neurological sense, part of who you are. They are not merely someone you know. They are part of your identity, a component of the neural network that constitutes your sense of self, your emotional baseline, your model of the world. When they die, part of you dies with them, not metaphorically, neurologically. The circuits that they were wired into no longer function as they were designed to function. The network that included them as a node is now missing a node, and the experience of this missing node, the phantom presence, the incomplete circuit, the network searching for its lost component, is grief. This is why grief changes who you are. Every bereaved person reports that they are not the same person after the loss. The world looks different. The future feels different. The self feels different. This is not merely a change in mood or perspective. It is a change in neural architecture, a literal restructuring of the brain's functional networks in response to the removal of a component that was integral to their operation. You are not the same person because your brain is not the same brain. The loved person was part of your brain, and now they are gone. The philosopher Thomas Nagel asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" The question of grief asks something equally fundamental. What is it like to be a person who has lost part of their own neural architecture? What is it like to be a network with a missing node? What is it like to be a brain that is searching, with the full force of its dopaminergic drive circuits, for a component that will never be found? The answer is, it is like grief, and nothing else is like grief, because no other experience involves the loss of a component of the self. The inter-brain synchrony research that we examined in our investigation of gravity deepens this picture in a way that is directly relevant to our question about whether the connection survives death. We established that people in close relationships develop synchronized brain activity, that their neural oscillations, particularly in the 40 Hz gamma band, become correlated during deep interaction, and that the synchronization increases with the depth and duration of the relationship. Mothers and infants show the strongest synchrony. long-term partners show stronger synchrony than new couples. And the synchrony is not merely a reflection of shared sensory input. It persists even when the two people are not in the same room, as long as the emotional bond is active. When one member of a synchronized pair dies, what happens to the synchrony? The neuroscience has not directly answered this question, because measuring interbrain synchrony requires two living brains. But the phenomenology of grief suggests an answer. The surviving brain continues to oscillate in the pattern that the synchrony established. The rhythm does not stop when one drummer stops. The surviving brain maintains the synchronized pattern, the neural habit, the oscillatory template, the ghost rhythm that the relationship created. And the waves of grief may be, in part, the surviving brain's synchronized oscillation, encountering the absence of the signal that used to sustain it. The rhythm continuing to play, but without the partner rhythm that gave it meaning. The psychologist Dennis Klass has challenged the traditional grief model, the model that says healthy grieving requires letting go of the deceased and moving on, with his continuing bonds theory. Klass documented, through extensive qualitative research, that most bereaved people do not let go of the deceased. They maintain an ongoing relationship with them, talking to them, sensing their presence, consulting them in decisions, feeling their influence on daily life. And this continuing bond is not pathological, it is healthy. People who maintain a continuing bond with the deceased show better long-term adjustment than people who try to sever the connection entirely. Klass's continuing bonds theory was controversial when he proposed it in 1996, but it has since been supported by extensive research and is now widely accepted in grief psychology. The healthy response to loss is not disconnection. It is transformation, the transformation of the relationship from one mediated by physical presence to one mediated by memory, by internalized values, by ongoing influence, and by a sense of continued connection that the bereaved person maintains through the rituals, practices, and inner dialogues that keep the relationship alive. In the entanglement framework, continuing bonds are not merely psychological coping mechanisms. They are the maintenance of quantum coherence, the deliberate, sustained attention to the neural patterns that the relationship created, which preserves the interbrain synchrony template even after the physical partner is gone. The bereaved person who talks to the deceased, who senses their presence, who consults them in decisions, is not deluding themselves. They are maintaining the oscillatory pattern, the 4-0 Hertz template, the synchronized rhythm that the relationship established and that the physics of information conservation guarantees has not been destroyed. The microchimerism data adds a biological dimension that makes the phantom limb analogy literal rather than metaphorical. As we established in our investigation of gravity, fetal cells cross the placental barrier during pregnancy and take up permanent residence in the mother's body, including her brain. These cells persist for decades. They are not inert passengers. They participate in the mother's biology, contributing to tissue repair, immune function, and potentially neural activity. The mother's brain literally contains part of her child, not a memory of her child, not a neural representation of her child, but actual biological material from her child's body, living and functioning within her neural tissue. When a mother loses a child, she does not merely lose a person she was emotionally attached to. She loses a person whose cells are embedded in her brain. The loss is not only psychological, it is biological, a disruption of a physical merger that began in the womb and that persists at the cellular level for as long as the mother lives. The grief of a mother who has lost a child is, in a precise biological sense, the grief of an organism that has lost part of itself, not metaphorically, but literally at the level of cellular identity. And the microchimerism persists after the child's death. The fetal cells remain in the mother's brain. The biological merger is not undone by the death of the child. The mother continues to carry, within her own neural tissue, living cells from a person who is no longer alive. The phantom limb is not just a neural representation. It is a biological reality, actual cells, actual DNA, actual quantum states from the lost person, persisting in the living brain of the survivor. This is where the investigation turns from neuroscience to physics, because the question is no longer merely, why does grief hurt? The neuroscience answers that grief hurts because the brain has built the lost person into its architecture, and the loss disrupts that architecture. The question is now, is the connection truly severed? Is the person you loved truly gone? Or is the connection that love created, the quantum correlations, the entanglement, the informational bonds still there, beneath the surface of the decoherent, macroscopic, sensory-deprived experience that grief imposes? The physics of information conservation says the connection is still there, and the argument is as follows. Every interaction between two systems creates a quantum correlation, an entanglement between the quantum states of the two systems. This entanglement is preserved by unitarity, the most fundamental law in quantum mechanics. The information contained in the correlation cannot be destroyed by any physical process. Not by time, not by distance, not by death, not even by a black hole. The information persists, encoded in the quantum state of the universe, permanent and irreversible. This is one of the most profound and most overlooked implications of quantum mechanics. The conservation of information is not merely a technical principle of interest to physicists. It is a statement about the permanence of everything that has ever happened. Every experience, every interaction, every moment of connection between two conscious beings is preserved in the quantum state of the universe with absolute fidelity. The information cannot be degraded. It cannot be overwritten. It cannot be erased. The moment you shared the specific, irreplaceable, unrepeatable moment of connection between your consciousness and theirs is a permanent feature of the universe's quantum state. It exists now. It will exist forever. Nothing can remove it. This means that the love you shared is not in the past. It is not a memory fading in a brain that will itself eventually die. It is an objective, permanent, physically real feature of the universe's quantum state, as real and as permanent as the mass of the electron or the charge of the proton. The love is not gone. The love is conserved. The laws of physics guarantee it. Every moment you spent with the person you loved created quantum correlations between your neural states and theirs. Every conversation, every touch, every shared meal, every moment of eye contact, every laugh, every argument, every silence, each one involved the exchange of quantum information between your brain and theirs, creating entanglement that unitarity preserves. The sum of all these interactions, the total entanglement between your quantum state and theirs, is the physical substrate of the love you shared. It is not a metaphor. It is not a feeling. It is a measurable, in-principle quantity of quantum mutual information that your interactions created and that the laws of physics guarantee will never be erased. When the person you loved died, their body ceased to function. Their brain ceased to generate neural activity. Their sensory apparatus ceased to transmit signals. The classical channels of communication, the voice, the touch, the gaze, the physical presence were terminated. The decoherence between your system and theirs became, at the macroscopic level, total. You can no longer see them, hear them, or touch them. The sensory channels are closed, but the entanglement is not closed. The quantum correlations that your interactions created are preserved by unitarity. They are encoded in the quantum state of the universe, in the correlations between the particles that constituted your shared experiences, in the entanglement between the quantum states of your neurons and the quantum states that their neurons occupied, in the informational residue of every moment you spent together. This information has not been destroyed by death. It cannot be destroyed by death. It is as permanent as the laws of physics themselves. The contemplative traditions have been saying this for millennia, and their descriptions of what survives death are, as we will see, remarkably consistent with the physics of information conservation. In Buddhism, the concept of karmic connection describes a bond between beings that persists across lifetimes. The connection is not mystical in the vague supernatural sense, it is informational. The karma that connects two beings is the accumulated informational content of their shared actions, shared intentions, and shared experiences. This information is not stored in the brain, which is impermanent. It is stored in the deeper structure of reality in what the Yogacara tradition calls the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, and what the physics would call the quantum state of the universe. The information persists because it cannot be destroyed. The connection persists because the information persists, and the beings are drawn together again in future lives by the gravitational pull of the accumulated information, the entanglement that their shared experiences created, and that nothing, not even death, can erase. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition's Bardo Thodol, the Book of the Dead, provides specific instructions for maintaining the connection with a dying or recently deceased person. The text is read aloud in the presence of the dying person and continues to be read for 49 days after death. Because the tradition maintains that the consciousness of the deceased can hear the living during the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. The reading is not merely a comfort for the living. It is a communication directed at the dead, a deliberate, sustained, attention-driven maintenance of the connection that death has threatened but not destroyed. The practice assumes that the channel is open, the entanglement is intact, the information can flow. In Christianity, the concept of the communion of saints describes a connection between the living and the dead that death does not sever. The Nicene Creed affirms belief in the communion of saints, the community of all believers, living and dead, united in the body of Christ. Paul's theology of the body is explicit. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. The body of Christ is not limited to the living. It includes the dead. The dead are not gone. They are members of the same body, connected to the living through the same love, the same entanglement, the same informational bond that united them in life. Death does not sever the connection. It transforms it from a connection mediated by the classical channels of sensory perception to a connection maintained by the deeper channels of spiritual communion. In Islam, the Prophet Muhammad taught that the dead are aware of the living. The deceased knows who washes his body, who carries his coffin, and who places him in his grave, one hadith states. Another, when you visit the graves, greet them with peace, for they hear you. The Islamic tradition maintains that the connection between the living and the dead is active, bidirectional, and sustained by the spiritual bond that the relationship created. The living can benefit the dead through prayer, charity, and the recitation of the Quran. And the dead, in the intermediate state of barzakh, maintain an awareness of the living that transcends the sensory channels that death has closed. In Hinduism, the Bhagavad Gita's central teaching about death is that the Atman, the true self, the consciousness that constitutes the deepest identity of every being, is not destroyed by the death of the body. The soul is not born, nor does it die. It is not that having been, it ceases to exist. It is unborn, eternal, permanent, and primeval. It is not slain when the body is slain. The connection between two Atmans, the love that united them, the shared experiences that bound them, the karmic entanglement that their relationship created, is a connection between eternal, indestructible entities. The body dies, the connection does not. In the next stage of this investigation, we will examine the physics of this claim in detail. We will ask whether the quantum correlations that love creates can survive the death of the physical body. We will explore the Penrose-Hameroff proposal that consciousness information is not destroyed at death, but redistributed into the quantum vacuum. And we will examine the anomalous evidence, the after-death communication reports, the deathbed visions, the shared death experiences that suggest the connection between the living and the dead may be not merely theoretical, but experientially real. The grief you feel is real, the absence is real, the pain is real. But the question of whether the connection that created the pain is truly severed, whether the love that made the grief possible has been destroyed by the death that caused it, is a question that the physics answers differently from the senses. The senses say, they are gone. The physics says, the information is conserved, the entanglement persists, the connection endures. And the grief may be not the evidence that the connection is broken, but the evidence that it is still there, still active, still pulling, still reaching across the decoherence barrier that death has imposed, like a gravitational force that you can feel but cannot see. We have established that grief is not merely an emotion. It is a neurobiological crisis, the brain's desperate, dopamine-driven search for a person who has been wired into its reward circuitry, its prediction models, and its sense of identity. The brain does not delete the lost person. It maintains their neural representation indefinitely, generating phantom presences, synchronized oscillation patterns, and waves of seeking behavior that can persist for years. The microchimerism data shows that a mother's brain literally contains cells from her child that persist after the child's death. And the continuing bonds research shows that the healthiest response to loss is not disconnection but the maintenance of an ongoing relationship with the deceased. Now we must ask the question that the neuroscience raises but cannot answer. Is the brain in grief delusional or perceptive? When the bereaved person senses the presence of the deceased, talks to them, feels their influence, and maintains a continuing bond that the neuroscience says is healthy? Are they maintaining a fiction that helps them cope? Or are they perceiving something real, a connection that death has obscured but not destroyed, a bond that the senses can no longer detect, but that the deeper circuits of the brain can still feel? The physics of information conservation provides a framework for answering this question, and the answer it provides is not the answer that the materialist paradigm expects. The argument begins with the most fundamental law in quantum mechanics, unitarity. We have encountered this principle throughout this series in the black hole information paradox, in the moral structure of the universe, in the holographic principle. But here, applied to the question of grief, it acquires its most personal and most consequential significance. Unitarity states that the total quantum information in a closed system is conserved. Information can be transformed, scrambled, redistributed, and encoded in forms that are unrecognizable to any practical measurement. But it cannot be created from nothing, and it cannot be destroyed. This is not an approximation. It is not a tendency. It is an absolute, exceptionless law that the entire edifice of quantum mechanics depends upon. If unitarity fails, quantum mechanics fails. And quantum mechanics does not fail. It is the most precisely tested theory in the history of science. Now apply unitarity to the death of a human being. A person is a physical system. Their body is composed of approximately 7 octillion atoms, each one in a specific quantum state. Their brain is a network of approximately 86 billion neurons, each one connected to thousands of others through synapses that encode the person's memories, personality, relationships, and identity. The total quantum state of the person, the complete description of every particle, every field, every correlation in their body and brain, is an inconceivably complex but physically real quantum state that constitutes, at the physical level, who they are. When the person dies, the body ceases to function. The neurons stop firing. The synapses stop transmitting. The heart stops beating. The metabolism stops running. The biological machinery that sustained the person's life has shut down. From the perspective of classical biology, the person is gone. The system has terminated. The information that constituted their identity has been lost. But from the perspective of quantum mechanics, the information has not been lost. It cannot be lost. Unitarity forbids it. The quantum state that constituted the person, every correlation, every entanglement, every bit of quantum information that encoded their memories, their personality, their relationships, and their identity is preserved. It has been transformed, certainly. It has been redistributed, certainly. As the body decomposes, the quantum information that was encoded in its molecular structure is transferred to the environment, to the soil, the air, the water, the microorganisms that process the body's remains. The information is scrambled beyond any practical possibility of reconstruction. But it is there. Every quantum bit of information that constituted the person is preserved in the quantum state of the universe, exactly as the Bekenstein-Hawking resolution of the black hole information paradox guarantees. Let us be precise about what this means, because precision matters when the stakes are this personal. When you held the hand of the person you loved, photons from your skin interacted with photons from their skin. Electrons in your molecules exchange quantum states with electrons in their molecules. Thermal photons from your body entangled with thermal photons from theirs. Each of these interactions created a quantum correlation, a permanent unitarity protected entanglement between your quantum state and theirs. A single handhold created billions of quantum correlations. A lifetime of shared physical contact created an astronomical number, and none of these correlations has been destroyed by death. Every one of them is preserved in the quantum state of the universe. The particles that carried the correlations have been redistributed. Some are in the soil, some are in the air, some have been absorbed by other living systems. But the correlations themselves are intact. The mutual information between your quantum state and theirs is conserved. The entanglement that your love created is as permanent as the law that preserves it. The physicist Seth Lloyd at MIT has calculated that the total quantum mutual information between two systems that have interacted extensively is enormous, far larger than the classical information that the systems exchange. Every handshake contains more quantum information than the entire classical internet, and this quantum information, unlike classical information, cannot be copied, cannot be erased, and cannot be degraded by noise. It is protected by the fundamental structure of quantum mechanics against every form of destruction that the physical world can inflict. This is not a comforting platitude. It is a consequence of the most fundamental law in physics. The person's information is not gone, it is redistributed, and the correlations that their interactions created the entanglement between their quantum state and the quantum states of every person they ever touched, every object they ever handled, every breath they ever exhaled are permanent features of the universe's quantum state that unitarity guarantees will persist for all time. The question is whether these preserved correlations have any experiential significance, whether the information that survives death can be felt, perceived, or accessed by the living. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction model provides a specific mechanism for how consciousness information might survive death. Penrose and Hameroff proposed that consciousness arises from quantum computations in the microtubules of neurons, cylindrical protein structures within every cell that Hameroff identified as potential sites of quantum coherence. In the Ortcom model, conscious moments arise when quantum superpositions in the microtubules reach a threshold of gravitational self-energy and undergo objective reduction. A quantum event, that produces a moment of conscious experience. The critical feature of the Ocho model for our investigation is what happens to the quantum information in the microtubules at death. Hameroff has proposed that when the brain dies and the microtubules decohere, the quantum information they contain is not destroyed. It is released into the quantum vacuum, into the entanglement structure of spacetime that, as we established in our investigations of distance and gravity, constitutes the fundamental ground of physical reality. The information dissipates from the localized microtubules into the delocalized vacuum, like a drop of ink dissolving into an ocean. The information is not concentrated in one place anymore. It is distributed across the quantum vacuum, but it is there. And the correlations between this distributed information and the quantum states of the living people who were entangled with the deceased are preserved by unitarity. Hameroff has described this process in terms that bridge the scientific and the contemplative. The quantum information in the microtubules isn't destroyed, it's distributed to the universe at large. If the patient is resuscitated, the quantum information can return to the microtubules, and the patient says, "I had a near-death experience." If the patient is not resuscitated and dies, it's possible that the quantum information can exist outside the body indefinitely as a soul. The mechanism Hameroff describes is specific and testable, at least in principle. The microtubules in every neuron contain tubulin proteins that can exist in quantum superposition simultaneously in two or more conformational states. In the Ocho model, these superpositions are the physical basis of conscious processing. When the superpositions collapse through objective reduction, a moment of conscious experience is produced. And the information content of the collapse, the specific pattern of tubulin states that constitutes the conscious moment, is not localized in the microtubules alone. It is entangled with the quantum vacuum through the gravitational self-energy that drives the collapse. The conscious moment is, at the moment of its creation, already partially encoded in the non-local structure of spacetime. At death, the microtubules decohere completely. The quantum superpositions that sustained conscious processing are no longer maintained by the biological machinery of the living brain. But the information that was entangled with the vacuum during every conscious moment of the person's life is still there, distributed across the quantum vacuum, encoded in the entanglement structure of spacetime, preserved by the same unitarity that preserves every other quantum correlation in the universe. The question of whether this distributed information retains any coherent structure, whether it constitutes anything like a unified consciousness rather than a formless cloud of quantum noise, is the question that the Ocho model cannot yet answer. Hameroff is careful to note that the survival of consciousness, information in the vacuum, is a possibility, not a certainty. But it is a possibility that is grounded in established physics, and that provides a specific mechanism for something that the contemplative traditions have been describing for millennia: the persistence of consciousness beyond the death of the body. This is a remarkable statement from a scientist of Hameroff's stature. He is not claiming to have proven the existence of the soul. He is noting that the physics of quantum information conservation is compatible with the survival of consciousness information beyond the death of the body, and that the mechanism for this survival, the dissipation of quantum information from microtubules into the quantum vacuum, is a natural consequence of the decoherence process that the Ocho model describes. David Bohm's implicate order provides a complementary framework. Bohm distinguished between the explicate order, the world of separate, spatially distributed, classically defined objects that we perceive with our senses, and the implicate order, the deeper level of reality in which everything is enfolded into everything else, in which separation does not exist, and in which the whole is present in every part. In Bohm's framework, the visible world is an unfolding of the implicate order, a projection from the deeper reality into the surface reality of ordinary experience. Death, in Bohm's framework, is the unfolding of the explicate back into the implicate. The person's visible form, their body, their brain, their sensory presence in the three-dimensional world dissolves. The explicate representation is withdrawn, but the information that constituted the person is not destroyed. It is enfolded back into the implicate order, where it continues to exist in a form that is not spatially localized, not temporally bounded, and not accessible through the ordinary channels of sensory perception, but that is, according to Bohm, as real as anything in the explicate world. The connection between the living and the dead, in Bohm's framework, is a connection through the implicate order. The living person exists partially in the explicate and partially in the implicate. The dead person exists entirely in the implicate. And the implicate order, because it is non-spatial and non-temporal, does not separate them. The connection that love created is an implicate connection, a correlation in the deeper order that is not affected by the dissolution of the explicate forms. The love persists because the implicate connection persists, and the grief of the living is the experience of being partially in the explicate and partially in the implicate, of feeling the pull of the implicate connection, while being unable to perceive it through the explicate channels that death has closed. Bohm's framework provides a specific vocabulary for understanding the experience of grief. The person you loved was a feature of the explicate order, a visible, tangible, sensory presence in the three-dimensional world. When they died, their explicate form dissolved, but their implicate reality, the deeper, non-spatial, non-temporal pattern from which their explicate form was projected, was not affected by the dissolution. The implicate Bohm describes is not subject to birth, death, or decay. It is the permanent, underlying reality from which the transient, surface reality of the explicate order is continuously generated. The grief you experience is the experience of living in the explicate, while the person you loved has returned to the implicate. You are in the projection. They are in the code. And the distance between the projection and the code is not a spatial distance that can be measured in meters or light years. It is an ontological distance, a difference in the level of reality at which you and they currently exist. You are on the surface, they are in the depth. And the surface and the depth are connected through the same implicate order that generates both. But the connection is not accessible through the sensory channels that operate exclusively in the explicate. This is why grief feels like a mismatch between what you know and what you feel. You know the person is gone, the sensory evidence is overwhelming, but you feel that they are still present, the continuing bond, the phantom presence, the sense of ongoing connection. In Bohm's framework, both the knowledge and the feeling are correct. The person is gone from the explicate. They are present in the implicate. And your consciousness, which spans both orders, perceives both the absence and the presence simultaneously. The grief is the experience of this dual perception, the agonizing awareness of absence at one level and presence at another, with no way to reconcile the two within the categories of ordinary experience. The physicist Paavo Pilkkinen, who has developed Bohm's ideas in the context of contemporary neuroscience, argues that the implicate order provides a natural framework for understanding how consciousness can survive the dissolution of the brain. If consciousness is a feature of the implicate order rather than the explicate order, if awareness belongs to the deeper level of reality rather than to the projected surface, then the dissolution of the brain does not destroy consciousness. It merely removes the explicate expression of a consciousness that continues to exist, fully and completely, in the implicate order from which it was always projected. Now, let us examine the anomalous evidence. Because the question of whether the connection between the living and the dead is merely theoretical or experientially real has been investigated not by physicists, but by researchers in a field that mainstream science has been reluctant to acknowledge: the study of after-death communication. In 1993, Bill and Judy Guggenheim published the results of a 7-year research project involving over 3,300 first-hand accounts of after-death communication ADC. The Guggenheims defined ADC as a spontaneous, unsolicited experience in which a living person perceives direct contact with a deceased person without the mediation of a psychic, a medium, or any other third party. The experiences included sensing the presence of the deceased, hearing their voice, seeing their apparition, feeling their touch, smelling their characteristic scent, and receiving communication through dreams. The scale of the phenomenon is remarkable. Studies conducted by multiple independent researchers in multiple countries have found that between 30 and 60% of bereaved people report at least one ADC experience following the death of a loved one. This is not a rare, fringe phenomenon. It is a common, widespread, cross-cultural experience that the majority of bereaved people have, but that most do not report because they fear being labelled delusional. The psychologist Erlendur Haraldsson at the University of Iceland conducted one of the most rigorous investigations of ADC, interviewing hundreds of bereaved people and analysing the characteristics of their experiences. Haraldsson found that ADC experiences were not correlated with psychiatric pathology, wishful thinking, or religious belief. People who had ADC experiences were not more depressed, more anxious, or more prone to hallucination than people who did not. The experiences occurred across all age groups, all educational levels, all religious backgrounds, and all cultural contexts. And the experiencers consistently reported that the ADC felt qualitatively different from a memory, a dream, or a hallucination, that it had a quality of realness, of presence, of otherness that distinguished it from any self-generated mental content. The most commonly reported form of ADC is the sense of presence, the unmistakable, physically palpable feeling that the deceased person is in the room. The experiencer does not see anything. They do not hear anything. They simply know with a certainty that they describe as qualitatively different from ordinary conviction that the person is there. The feeling typically lasts for seconds to minutes and is accompanied by a sense of peace, comfort, and reassurance that the bereaved person describes as transformative. The second most common form is the dream visit, a dream in which the deceased appears in vivid, realistic detail, behaves in character, and communicates a specific message, typically of reassurance or farewell. Bereaved people who have dream visits consistently distinguish them from ordinary dreams. The dream visit is more vivid, more coherent, more emotionally intense, and more memorable than any ordinary dream. The deceased person appears healthy, whole, and at peace, regardless of how they died. And the experiencer wakes with a sense of having been genuinely contacted, not merely of having dreamed about the person. In the quantum framework, the dream visit is particularly significant. We established in our investigation of dreams that the dreaming brain operates with reduced decoherence, that the sensory gating is closed, the environmental noise is reduced, and the brain's quantum states may be more coherent than during waking. If the entanglement between the bereaved person and the deceased is preserved by unitarity, and if the decoherence barrier between them thins during sleep, then the dream visit may be a genuine perception, a brief glimpse of the deceased through the entanglement channel that the reduced decoherence of sleep has temporarily opened. The dream visit would not be a memory of the deceased. It would be a contact with the deceased, mediated by the same quantum correlations that the relationship created, and that unitarity preserves. The shared death experience, documented by the physician Raymond Moody and subsequently by researchers including Peter Fenwick and Pim van Lommel, provides another category of anomalous evidence. In a shared death experience, a person who is present at the bedside of a dying person reports experiencing some or all of the features typically associated with near-death experiences, the sense of leaving the body, the tunnel, the light, the life review, the encounter with deceased relatives, but the experiencer is not dying. They are healthy. They are merely present at the death of another person, and they are somehow drawn into the dying person's experience. Moody has collected hundreds of shared death experience accounts, and the pattern is consistent. The experiencer feels a sudden shift in consciousness at the moment of the other person's death, as if they are being drawn into a shared experiential space that the dying person is entering. The experience is not initiated by the experiencer. It is not expected. It is not correlated with any known psychological or neurological condition. And it is, by the accounts of those who have had it, one of the most profound and most transformative experiences of their lives. In the entanglement framework, shared death experiences have a natural interpretation. If the dying person's consciousness is releasing its quantum information into the vacuum as the Ortshaw model proposes, and if the bedside companion is strongly entangled with the dying person through years of close relationship, then the release of quantum information from the dying person's microtubules could produce a correlated experience in the companion's consciousness. The companion is not imagining the dying person's experience. They are perceiving it through the entanglement channel that their relationship created as the dying person's quantum information transitions from the explicate to the implicate, from the localized microtubules to the delocalized vacuum, from the visible to the invisible. Deathbed visions experiences reported by dying people in which they see deceased relatives, beings of light, or otherworldly landscapes in the hours or days before death have been documented by Carlis Osis and Erlendur Haraldsson in a landmark cross-cultural study involving over 1,000 cases in the United States and India. The visions were remarkably consistent across cultures. The dying person sees deceased relatives who appear to be welcoming them, beckoning them, preparing them for the transition. The visions are not correlated with medication, fever, or brain dysfunction. They occur in patients who are alert, oriented, and cognitively intact, and they are consistently reported as calming, reassuring, and profoundly real, qualitatively different from hallucinations, which are typically frightening and disorienting. The terminal lucidity phenomenon, which we examined in our investigation of death, adds further evidence. Terminal lucidity is the unexpected return of clarity, coherence, and communicative ability in patients who have been severely cognitively impaired, sometimes for years, shortly before death. Patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease who have not recognized their family members or spoken coherently in months suddenly become alert, oriented, and able to have meaningful conversations in the hours before death. The phenomenon has been documented by Michael Nahm and Bruce Grayson in a systematic review that identified numerous cases across multiple medical contexts. Terminal lucidity is deeply problematic for the materialist model of consciousness. If consciousness is produced by the brain, and if the brain has been severely damaged by disease, then the return of full consciousness shortly before death should be impossible. The neural substrate that produces consciousness is, by definition, degraded beyond the point of supporting coherent awareness. And yet, coherent awareness returns. The materialist explanation that some unknown compensatory mechanism temporarily restores brain function is unsatisfying, because no such mechanism has been identified, and the severe structural damage in many cases makes temporary restoration implausible. In the entanglement framework, terminal lucidity suggests that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but received by the brain, that the brain is a transceiver, a tuner, a filter that processes consciousness rather than generating it. When the brain is damaged, the filter is distorted, and the consciousness it transmits is fragmented and incoherent. But as death approaches and the brain's filtering function begins to dissolve, the consciousness that was always present beneath the filter's distortion becomes briefly accessible. Terminal lucidity is not the brain generating a final burst of consciousness. It is the brain's filter dissolving, allowing the consciousness that was always there in the implicate order, in the quantum vacuum, in the entanglement structure of spacetime to shine through unobstructed. The philosopher William James proposed the transmission theory of consciousness in 1898, the idea that the brain does not produce consciousness but transmits it, the way a radio does not produce music but receives and transmits a signal that exists independently of the radio. James argued that the correlation between brain states and conscious states, which materialists interpret as evidence that the brain produces consciousness, is equally compatible with the hypothesis that the brain receives consciousness. A damaged radio produces distorted music. A damaged brain produces distorted consciousness. But the distortion does not prove that the radio produces the music or that the brain produces the consciousness. It proves only that the transmission mechanism is impaired. James's transmission theory, once dismissed as unscientific, has been revived by the philosopher Edward Kelly and colleagues at the University of Virginia in their comprehensive work Irreducible Mind, which documents extensive evidence for phenomena that the production theory cannot explain. Terminal lucidity, savant syndrome, near-death experiences, and the extraordinary cognitive abilities that occasionally emerge in patients with severe brain damage. Each of these phenomena is problematic for the production theory, but natural for the transmission theory. And the quantum framework provides the mechanism. The brain transmits consciousness from the implicate order, from the quantum vacuum, from the entanglement structure of space-time, and when the brain is damaged, the transmission is distorted, and when the brain dies, the transmission ceases, but the consciousness continues to exist in the ground from which it was always being transmitted. We must be honest about the status of this evidence. The ADC reports are anecdotal and retrospective. The most commonly reported form of ADC is the sense of presence, the unmistakable, physically palpable feeling that the deceased person is in the room. The experiencer does not see anything. They do not hear anything. They simply know, with a certainty that they describe as qualitatively different from ordinary conviction, that the person is there. The feeling typically lasts for seconds to minutes and is accompanied by a sense of peace, comfort, and reassurance that the bereaved person describes as transformative. The second most common form is the dream visit, a dream in which the deceased appears in vivid, realistic detail, behaves in character, and communicates a specific message, typically of reassurance or farewell. Bereaved people who have dream visits consistently distinguish them from ordinary dreams. The dream visit is more vivid, more coherent, more emotionally intense, and more memorable than any ordinary dream. The deceased person appears healthy, whole, and at peace, regardless of how they died. And the experience awakes with a sense of having been genuinely contacted, not merely of having dreamed about the person. In the quantum framework, the dream visit is particularly significant. We established in our investigation of dreams that the dreaming brain operates with reduced decoherence, that the sensory gating is closed, the environmental noise is reduced, and the brain's quantum states may be more coherent than during waking. If the entanglement between the bereaved person and the deceased is preserved by unitarity, and if the decoherence barrier between them thins during sleep, then the dream visit may be a genuine perception, a brief glimpse of the deceased through the entanglement channel that the reduced decoherence of sleep has temporarily opened. The dream visit would not be a memory of the deceased. It would be a contact with the deceased mediated by the same quantum correlations that the relationship created and that unitarity preserves. The shared death experiences are not reproducible in a laboratory. The deathbed visions, while cross-culturally consistent, admit alternative explanations involving endorphin release, cerebral hypoxia, and the brain's response to the dying process. And terminal lucidity, while documented, is rare and poorly understood. None of this evidence constitutes proof that the connection between the living and the dead is physically real, but it constitutes a pattern, a consistent, cross-cultural, cross-methodological pattern that is compatible with the physics of information conservation and that the materialist framework has not explained. The contemplative traditions have not merely described this connection, they have developed practices for maintaining it. In Buddhism, the practice of power consciousness transference is a specific meditation technique performed at the moment of death, designed to direct the dying person's consciousness toward a favorable rebirth. The practice is performed by the dying person if they are able, or by a skilled practitioner on their behalf, and the tradition maintains that the practitioner's consciousness can assist the dying person's consciousness during the transition, can guide it, support it, and help it navigate the bardo through the entanglement channel that the relationship and the shared practice created. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition provides the most detailed practical instructions for assisting the dying and the dead. The Bardo Thodol, the Book of the Dead, describes the experiences that consciousness undergoes during the 49 days between death and rebirth, and it provides specific instructions for navigating each stage. The text is read aloud to the dying person and continues to be read after death, because the tradition maintains that the deceased's consciousness can hear the living during the bardo. The reading is not merely a ritual, it is a communication, a sustained, attention-driven, intentional transmission of coherent information through the entanglement channel that the relationship created. The monk or lama who performs the reading is not merely reciting words. They are generating a state of concentrated, compassionate, quantum coherent awareness and directing it toward the deceased through the entanglement bond. The practice requires deep meditative attainment, the ability to maintain the 4-0 Hertz gamma coherence that we have associated with enhanced quantum processing and enhanced sensitivity to non-local correlations. The more accomplished the practitioner, the more effective the guidance is said to be, which is consistent with the entanglement framework. A more coherent consciousness can transmit more coherent information through the entanglement channel, producing a clearer signal at the receiving end. The practice of dedicating merit to the deceased, transferring the spiritual benefits of practice to the dead, is a central feature of Buddhist ritual in every school. The practice assumes that the connection between the living and the dead is active and bidirectional, that the living can benefit the dead through their practice, and that the benefit is transmitted through a channel that death has not closed. In the entanglement framework, the transfer of merit is the transmission of coherent quantum information from the living practitioner's consciousness to the deceased's quantum state through the entanglement correlations that their relationship created, and that unitarity preserves. In Christianity, the practice of praying for the dead is one of the oldest and most universal features of Christian worship. The Orthodox and Catholic traditions maintain liturgical prayers for the deceased, memorial services at specific intervals after death, and the belief that the prayers of the living can assist the souls of the dead in their journey toward God. The practice assumes the same thing that the Buddhist practice assumes. The connection is active, the channel is open, and the attention of the living can affect the experience of the dead. In Islam, the tradition of dua for the deceased, supplication to God on behalf of the dead, is a fundamental obligation of the living toward the dead. The Prophet Muhammad taught that three things continue to benefit a person after death: ongoing charity, knowledge that benefits others, and a righteous child who prays for them. The child's prayer reaches the deceased, crosses the barrier of death, and delivers benefit to a consciousness that is no longer embodied, but that is still, in the Islamic understanding, aware, responsive, and connected to the living through the bonds that life created. In the next stage of this investigation, we will explore the geometry of grief, the specific question of what the loss of a loved one means in the framework of emergent spacetime, where distance is a measure of entanglement, deficit, and separation is a product of decoherence. Because if grief is the experience of increased decoherence between two previously entangled systems, then the question of whether the grief can be resolved, whether the connection can be restored, the barrier thinned, the decoherence reduced, becomes a question not merely of psychological healing, but of physics, and the practices that the traditions prescribe for maintaining the connection with the dead may be, in the most literal sense available to science, practices for reducing the decoherence that death imposes and restoring the entanglement that love created. We have established that the information constituting a human being is not destroyed at death. Unitarity guarantees that the quantum correlations between you and the person you loved are preserved in the quantum state of the universe. The Penrose-Hameroff model provides a specific mechanism by which consciousness information may survive the death of the brain, dissipating from the microtubules into the quantum vacuum. Bohm's implicate order provides a framework in which death is not the end of the person, but the unfolding of their explicate form back into the deeper reality from which it was always projected. And the anomalous evidence, the after-death communications, the shared death experiences, the deathbed visions, the terminal lucidity suggests that the connection between the living and the dead may be not merely theoretical, but experientially real. Now we must bring these findings into direct contact with the framework we have been constructing throughout this entire series. Because the physics of emergent spacetime, the physics of entanglement, and the physics of decoherence give us a language for understanding grief that is more precise, more specific, and potentially more useful than any language that psychology or philosophy has previously offered. In our investigation of distance, we established that space is emergent, woven from quantum entanglement through the mechanism that Van Ramsdonk, Swingle, and the Ryu-Takayanagi formula describe. Distance is not a fundamental property of reality. It is a derived quantity that measures the entanglement deficit between two quantum systems. When two systems are maximally entangled, the distance between them is zero. They are, in the deeper geometry, the same point. When the entanglement between them decreases, the distance increases. And when the entanglement is completely removed, the distance becomes infinite. The two systems are completely disconnected, with no geometric relationship between them. In our investigation of gravity, we established that the attraction between systems is produced by the entanglement between them, that gravity is the geometric expression of entanglement, the curvature of space-time that draws entangled systems together. And we propose that love is the conscious experience of this same entanglement, the experiential expression of the quantum correlations that connect two conscious systems. Now apply this framework to death and grief. When you are in a close relationship with another person, the entanglement between your quantum states is high, your brains are synchronized, your neural oscillations are correlated, your microchimeric cells are shared, your quantum mutual information is enormous. In the language of emergent space-time, the distance between you is small, not merely the spatial distance that separates your bodies, but the deeper, entanglement-defined distance that measures how connected your quantum states are. You are, in the geometry of consciousness, close, in a way that has nothing to do with how many meters separate your bodies and everything to do with how many quantum correlations connect your minds. When the person you love dies, something specific happens to this geometry. The classical channels that maintain the entanglement, the voice, the touch, the gaze, the physical presence, are terminated. The sensory signals that sustain the interbrain synchrony cease. The neurochemical environment that supported the bond is disrupted. From the perspective of the macroscopic, decoherent, classical world, the connection is severed. The distance between you and the person you loved has become, at the classical level, infinite. They are no longer accessible through any sensory channel. They are no longer present in the three-dimensional world. The classical geometry says they are gone, but the quantum geometry says something different. The entanglement that your interactions created is preserved by unitarity. The quantum correlations between your neural states and theirs persist in the quantum state of the universe. The mutual information has not been erased. It has been redistributed from the concentrated, localized form it took in the living brain to the distributed, delocalized form it takes in the quantum vacuum. But it is there. And in the deeper geometry, the geometry defined by entanglement, rather than by classical spatial relationships, the distance between you and the person you loved has not become infinite. It has increased, certainly. The decoherence imposed by death has thickened the barrier between your conscious states. But the entanglement beneath the barrier is intact. The quantum distance, the true distance, the distance that measures the entanglement between your quantum states, is not infinite. It is finite. It is there. The connection has been obscured, but it has not been destroyed. Consider what this means concretely. You are sitting in a room. The person you loved is not in the room. The classical description says, the distance between you and them is the distance between your location and their grave, or the distance between your location and the place where their ashes were scattered. Or if you take the materialist view, the distance is undefined, because they no longer exist as a locatable entity. The classical description offers only absence, but the quantum description offers something different. The quantum description says, the entanglement between your quantum state and theirs is a specific, measurable, non-zero quantity. The mutual information is conserved, the correlations persist. And in the geometry defined by these correlations, the geometry that, according to Van Ramsdonk and the holographic principle, is more fundamental than the classical spatial geometry, the distance between you and them is not infinite. It is not undefined. It is finite, specific, and determined by the degree of entanglement that your shared life created. You are closer to them than you are to a stranger on the other side of the world, because you shared more quantum correlations with them than with any stranger. The quantum geometry does not recognize death as a discontinuity. It recognizes death as an increase in the decoherence barrier, a thickening of the veil between the classical surface and the quantum depth. But it does not recognize death as a severing of the connection, because the connection is maintained by entanglement, and entanglement is not affected by the dissolution of the classical form. This is the geometry of grief. Grief is the experience of a sudden catastrophic increase in the decoherence barrier between two previously closely entangled systems. The classical channels have closed. The sensory signals have ceased. The macroscopic distance has become, for all practical purposes, infinite. But the quantum distance, the entanglement-defined distance that measures the true connection, remains finite. You are separated at the surface and connected at the depth. The grief is the experience of this dual reality, the agonizing awareness of surface separation coexisting with the persistent, inarticulate, often dismissed feeling of deep connection. This geometry explains why grief feels the way it does. It does not feel like ordinary sadness, which arises from circumstances that can change. It does not feel like disappointment, which fades as expectations adjust. It feels like a tear in the fabric of reality, because that is what it is. The emergent geometry of your conscious world has been disrupted. A region of space-time that was curved toward connection, curved by the entanglement between your consciousness and theirs, has been abruptly flattened by the decoherence that death imposes. The curvature that drew you together, the gravitational pull that we identified as love in our investigation of gravity, has not disappeared, but it is operating beneath a barrier that the senses cannot penetrate. You can feel the pull. You cannot see the source. And the mismatch between what you feel and what you see is the specific, irreducible, geometrically precise experience of grief. The bereaved person who says, "I feel like part of me is missing," is not speaking metaphorically. In the geometry of entanglement, part of them is missing the part of their quantum state that was correlated with the deceased, the part of their conscious geometry that was curved by the entanglement with the person who died. The missing part is not gone. It is on the other side of the decoherence barrier, but it is inaccessible through the classical channels that the living person uses to navigate the macroscopic world. The feeling of absence is the geometrically accurate perception of a region of conscious space-time that has been disconnected from the surface, but that remains connected at the depth. The bereaved person who says, "I feel them everywhere," is also not speaking metaphorically. In the quantum framework, the deceased's information has been distributed across the vacuum, delocalized, spread across the entanglement structure of space-time, present everywhere rather than localized in a single body. The bereaved person is perceiving, however dimly, this delocalized presence, the quantum information of the deceased, encoded in the vacuum, pervading the entanglement structure of space-time that the living person inhabits. The deceased is everywhere because their information is everywhere, and the feeling of their pervasive presence is the accurate, if preconscious, perception of this physical fact. The waves of grief, in this framework, are moments when the quantum connection briefly penetrates the decoherence barrier. The brain, oscillating in the synchronized pattern that the relationship established, occasionally generates a state that is coherent enough to detect the preserved entanglement beneath the decoherent surface. The phantom presence, the sudden sense that the person is in the room, the unexpected feeling of peace or warmth that arrives without explanation. These may be moments when the decoherence barrier thins and the quantum connection becomes momentarily perceptible. The wave is not merely a neurochemical fluctuation. It is a glimpse, a brief, fleeting, decoherence-limited perception of the connection that death obscured but did not destroy. The after-death communication experiences that we examined in the previous stage acquire specific geometric meaning in this framework. The sense of presence that 30 to 60% of bereaved people report is not a hallucination. It is a perception of the preserved entanglement between the bereaved person's quantum state and the deceased's quantum state, momentarily perceptible because the decoherence barrier has temporarily thinned. The dream visits, which occur during the reduced decoherence state of REM sleep, are moments when the barrier is thin enough for coherent information to pass through the entanglement channel. And the shared death experiences, which occur at the moment of death when the dying person's quantum information is being released into the vacuum, are moments when the entanglement between the dying person and the bedside companion is so strongly activated that coherent experiential content can cross the decoherence barrier in real time. The dream visits deserve particular attention in this geometric framework. In our investigation of dreams, we established that the dreaming brain operates with reduced environmental coupling. The sensory gates are closed, the external noise is diminished, and the brain's internal states are more isolated from the decoherent influence of the macroscopic environment. This reduced decoherence means that the brain's sensitivity to quantum correlations is enhanced during sleep. Correlations that are too weak to be detected during the noisy, decoherent conditions of waking consciousness become perceptible during the quiet, coherent conditions of deep sleep and REM. If the entanglement between the bereaved person and the deceased is preserved by unitarity but normally obscured by the decoherence of waking consciousness, then sleep is precisely the condition under which the entanglement should become detectable. The dream visit is not a memory replay. It is not a wish fulfillment fantasy. It is a quantum perception, a perception of the deceased's preserved quantum information through the entanglement channel that the relationship created. made possible by the reduced decoherence of the sleeping brain. This explains the consistent phenomenology of dream visits. They feel qualitatively different from ordinary dreams. Because they are qualitatively different, they involve the perception of an external quantum signal rather than the generation of internal neural patterns. The deceased appears healthy and whole because the quantum information that constitutes their consciousness is not affected by the disease or trauma that destroyed their body. The information is preserved in its pre-death state, encoded in the correlations that the relationship created during the period of health. And the message of the dream visit is typically simple: I am okay, I am still here, I love you, because the bandwidth of the entanglement channel through the decoherence barrier is limited, allowing only the most essential, most emotionally charged information to pass through. The continuing bonds research, which we discussed in part 1, now acquires a precise physical interpretation. Dennis Klass documented that bereaved people who maintain an ongoing relationship with the deceased, who talk to them, sense their presence, and feel their influence, show better long-term adjustment than those who try to sever the connection. In the entanglement framework, this makes exact physical sense. The continuing bond is the deliberate, sustained maintenance of the quantum coherence pattern that the relationship created. The bereaved person who talks to the deceased is generating the neural oscillation patterns that were established during the relationship, maintaining the synchronized template that serves as the receiver for the preserved entanglement. They are keeping the channel open. They are reducing the decoherence on their side of the barrier. And the result, better adjustment, less depression, more meaning, more peace, is the result of maintaining connection with a reality that is physically present, not the result of maintaining a useful fiction. The contemplative traditions have developed specific practices for maintaining and deepening this connection. Practices that amount, in the physics framework, to systematic techniques for reducing the decoherence barrier between the living and the dead. In Buddhism, the practice of Tonglen, the meditation of giving and taking, is used both for the benefit of the living and the dead. In Tonglen, the practitioner breathes in the suffering of others and breathes out compassion, healing, and well-being. When directed toward the deceased, Tonglen is a practice of sending coherent, compassionate, quantum coherent attention through the entanglement channel that the relationship created. The practitioner is not merely imagining that they are helping the deceased, they are generating a specific state of consciousness, a state of high gamma, high coherence, high compassion awareness, and directing it toward the deceased through the preserved correlations that unitarity maintains. The neuroscience of Tonglen practice supports the physical interpretation. Davidson and Lutz have shown that Tonglen generates a specific brain state characterized by high gamma coherence, enhanced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, and increased activity in the insula, the region associated with embodied empathy and interoceptive awareness. This brain state is precisely the state that would maximize the brain's sensitivity to quantum correlations and maximize the coherence of any signal transmitted through entanglement channels. The Tonglen practitioner is not merely imagining that they are sending compassion to the deceased. They are generating a neurophysiological state that is optimized for quantum communication through entanglement channels. The practice of power consciousness transference takes this further. In Phawa, the practitioner visualizes their consciousness leaving the body through the crown of the head and merging with the consciousness of the deceased, or with the consciousness of a Buddha or Bodhisattva. The visualization is accompanied by specific breathing techniques and mantras that generate a powerful, concentrated state of awareness focused on the crown chakra. Advanced practitioners report a physical sensation at the crown, a tingling, a warmth, sometimes a visible mark that the tradition interprets as evidence that the practice is working. In the entanglement framework, the FOA visualization is a technique for concentrating the practitioner's quantum coherence and directing it through a specific entanglement channel, the channel that connects the practitioner's consciousness to the consciousness of the target through the quantum vacuum. The Tibetan tradition's 49-day mourning period, during which specific practices are performed for the benefit of the deceased, is a systematic decoherence reduction program. Each day, the practitioner generates concentrated, compassionate awareness and directs it toward the deceased. The practice is not merely ritual, it is physical intervention, an intervention in the entanglement structure of reality, performed through the one instrument that can interact with the quantum vacuum directly, consciousness. The Buddhist teacher Sogyal Rinpoche, in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, described the relationship between the living and the dead in terms that directly parallel the physics of decoherence and entanglement. The deceased are not far away, they are near. The barrier between us and them is not a wall. It is a veil thin, permeable, and responsive to the quality of attention that we bring to it. The more concentrated, the more compassionate, the more coherent our attention, the thinner the veil becomes. The more distracted, the more fearful, the more scattered our attention, the thicker the veil becomes. The practice of meditation for the deceased is the practice of thinning the veil, of reducing the decoherence that separates the living from the dead, until the connection that was always there becomes perceptible. In Christianity, the liturgical practice of praying for the dead serves the same function. The Orthodox tradition's practice of memorial services at the 3rd day, 9th day, 40th day, an anniversary of death is a systematic schedule of decoherence-reducing interventions, specific occasions on which the community gathers to direct, concentrated, loving attention toward the deceased through the entanglement bonds that the community's relationship with the deceased created. The Christian practice of the Eucharist in memory of the dead is particularly significant. The Eucharist is the practice in which the community gathers to share in the body and blood of Christ, to participate in the divine entanglement that, in the Christian understanding, connects all members of the body of Christ, living and dead. When the Eucharist is offered for the repose of the soul of a specific deceased person, the community is directing the collective coherence of Eucharistic worship toward the deceased through the entanglement channels that the communion of saints provides. The living and the dead are members of the same body. The entanglement between them is maintained by the divine entanglement that constitutes the body. And the Eucharist is the practice that activates this entanglement, making the connection between the living and the dead experientially real. The practice of lighting candles for the dead, universal across Catholic and Orthodox Christianity, has a specific resonance in the entanglement framework. Light is coherent electromagnetic radiation. A candle flame is a source of thermal photons that, while not coherent in the laser sense, produces a sustained electromagnetic field in the environment of the prayer. The act of lighting a candle and directing prayer toward the deceased while in the presence of the candle's light is the act of creating a local environment of enhanced electromagnetic coherence while simultaneously directing concentrated, loving attention toward the deceased. Whether the photons from the candle have any direct effect on the entanglement between the living and the dead is unknown, but the practice combines the two elements that the entanglement framework identifies as essential: concentrated attention, the prayer, and a coherent physical environment, the candle's light, that may reduce the local decoherence and enhance the practitioner's sensitivity to quantum correlations. The practice of visiting graves, universal across Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and many other traditions, serves the same function. The grave is a high entanglement node, a specific location in physical space that is maximally associated with the deceased, and that therefore activates the strongest neural representations of the person and the strongest entanglement correlations with their quantum state. The act of visiting the grave is the act of placing your consciousness in the physical location where the entanglement signal from the deceased is strongest and directing concentrated attention through that channel. The Orthodox theologian Alexander Schmemann described the Eucharist as the act that reveals death to be a lie. In the Eucharist, Schmemann wrote, "We remember the dead not because they are absent, but because they are present. The memorial is not a reminder of absence. It is a celebration of presence." In the entanglement framework, Schmemann is correct, not metaphorically but physically. The dead are present. They are present in the preserved entanglement correlations that unitarity maintains. They are present in the quantum vacuum into which their consciousness information has been distributed. And they are present in the Eucharist because the Eucharist is the practice that reduces the decoherence barrier between the living and the dead and reveals the presence that the barrier normally conceals. In Islam, the practice of dua for the deceased is surrounded by specific conditions that enhance its efficacy, conditions that, in the entanglement framework, correspond to conditions that reduce decoherence and enhance quantum coherence. The dua should be performed with sincerity, with concentrated, undivided attention. It should be performed with certainty, with the confident expectation that the prayer will reach the deceased. It should be performed with emotional depth, with the love and the grief that connect the living to the dead. And it should be performed regularly at the grave, on Fridays, during Ramadan, and at specific intervals after the death. Each of these conditions corresponds to a factor that enhances quantum coherence. Sincerity is concentrated attention, the sustained, focused awareness that generates high gamma neural oscillations and enhanced quantum coherence in the brain. Certainty is the elimination of doubt, the removal of the cognitive noise that generates internal decoherence and that weakens the coherent signal that the prayer transmits. Emotional depth is the activation of the attachment circuits that were entangled with the deceased, the nucleus accumbens, the oxytocin system, the neural networks that were synchronized with the deceased during life, and that serve as the receiving antenna for the preserved entanglement. And regularity is the sustained, repeated practice that maintains the coherence pattern over time, preventing the decoherence barrier from thickening and keeping the channel open. The Islamic tradition's insistence that the dua reaches the deceased is not a metaphorical claim. It is a phenomenological report confirmed by centuries of practitioners and codified in the Hadith literature. The Prophet Muhammad's teaching that the deceased benefits from the charity of the living, the knowledge they left behind, and the prayers of their children describes 3 specific entanglement channels through which the living can affect the quantum state of the deceased. Charity is the physical extension of the deceased's entanglement into the material world, the ongoing causal influence of their generosity on the entanglement structure of the community they served. Knowledge is the informational extension, the ideas, the insights, the wisdom that the deceased shared and that continue to shape the consciousness of the living through the entanglement of teacher and student. And the child's prayer is the most direct channel, the parent-child entanglement, strengthened by microchimerism, sustained by a lifetime of shared experience, and directed by the concentrated, loving attention of the surviving child. The Hadith: when a person dies, their deeds come to an end except for 3: ongoing charity, knowledge that benefits, and a righteous child who prays for them, is, in the entanglement framework, a precise description of the 3 mechanisms by which the living can maintain and influence the quantum state of the deceased. The deeds end because the classical causal channels have closed, but the quantum channels, the channels of ongoing entanglement through charity, knowledge and prayer, remain open. And the deceased's quantum state continues to be influenced by the entanglement that these channels maintain. The Sufi tradition describes the most advanced practitioners as capable of direct communication with the deceased, not through mediumship or divination, but through the purity and the depth of their contemplative awareness. The Sufi master who has achieved fana, the dissolution of the ego boundary, has reduced their internal decoherence to such a degree that the entanglement channels between their consciousness and the consciousness of the deceased become directly perceptible. They can perceive the deceased not as a memory, but as a presence, a quantum presence, preserved in the entanglement structure of the vacuum, accessible to any consciousness that has thinned its decoherence barrier sufficiently to perceive it. In Hinduism, the Shraddha ceremonies, the ancestral rites performed at specific intervals after death and annually thereafter, serve the same function. The rites involve the offering of food, water, and prayers to the deceased ancestors, performed with specific mantras and specific ritual actions that the tradition maintains are effective in reaching the consciousness of the deceased. The efficacy of the Shraddha is not magical. It is attentional, the concentrated, intentional, emotionally charged attention of the living, directed toward the deceased through the karmic entanglement that their shared life created. The Bhagavad Gita provides the theoretical framework. The Atman is eternal, the body is temporary, and the connection between Atmans is a connection between eternal entities that the temporary dissolution of the body cannot affect. The Shraddha is not an attempt to reach a person who is gone. It is an attempt to maintain contact with a person who is still present, present in the eternal Atman, present in the karmic web, present in the quantum vacuum, present in the implicate order from which the explicate world is continuously projected. The Jewish tradition's practice of Yizkor, the memorial prayer, recited 4 times a year in synagogue, and the annual Yahrzeit, the anniversary of a loved one's death, observed by lighting a candle that burns for 24 hours, are practices of sustained, rhythmic, community-supported attention directed toward the deceased. The Kaddish, recited daily for 11 months after the death of a parent, is not a prayer for the dead, it is a prayer of praise to God. But its effect, in the entanglement framework, is the daily generation of a high coherence, high devotion state of consciousness that is connected to the deceased through the entanglement of the parent-child bond. The Kaddish is recited in community. It requires a minyan, a quorum of 10. This communal requirement is significant in the entanglement framework. The collective coherence of 10 minds, focused on the same intention, generates a stronger entanglement signal than a single mind alone. The communal aspect is not merely a social support mechanism. It is a quantum amplification mechanism, the collective attention of the community, producing a signal that is 10 times stronger, 10 times more coherent, and 10 times more likely to penetrate the decoherence barrier than any individual prayer. Each recitation of the Kaddish is a pulse of coherence directed through the entanglement channel. The 11 months of daily recitation is a sustained program of decoherence reduction that keeps the channel open during the critical period when the deceased's quantum information is transitioning from its localized, embodied form to its distributed, vacuum-encoded form. The Aboriginal Australian tradition of sorry business, the complex mourning practices that follow a death in Aboriginal communities, provides a further example. Sorry business involves not only grief rituals but also the avoidance of the deceased's name, the avoidance of their image, and the avoidance of the places they frequented. These practices are often misunderstood as superstitious taboos, but in the entanglement framework, they have a specific logic. The deceased's name, image, and places are high entanglement nodes, points in the entanglement network where the connection between the living and the deceased is strongest. The avoidance practices are a way of managing the decoherence barrier during the vulnerable period immediately after death, reducing the intensity of the entanglement signals that could overwhelm the grieving community. While the deceased's quantum information is transitioning from its localized to its distributed form, The Aboriginal practice of singing the deceased spirit to rest, performing specific songs and ceremonies that guide the spirit to the appropriate realm, is structurally identical to the Tibetan practice of reading the breeze, Bardo Thodol. In both cases, the living are directing concentrated, culturally specific, ritually structured attention toward the deceased through the entanglement channels that the community's relationship with the deceased created. The song is not a metaphor. It is a signal, a coherent, intentional, attention-driven signal transmitted through quantum channels that the relationship established and that death has not closed. The convergence across traditions is complete. Every major religious tradition has developed practices for maintaining the connection between the living and the dead. The practices differ in their ritual forms, their theological frameworks, and their cultural contexts, but they share the same structure: concentrated, loving, sustained attention directed toward the deceased through the bond that the relationship created. In every tradition, the practice assumes that the connection is real, that the channel is open, and that the attention of the living can reach the consciousness of the dead. And in every tradition, the practitioners who perform the practices most deeply and most consistently report the same result: the sense that the deceased is present, that the connection is active, and that the barrier between the living and the dead is not a wall, but a veil. In the final stage of this investigation, we will bring everything together: the neuroscience of grief, the physics of information conservation, the geometry of entanglement, and the contemplative practices that maintain the bond. We will ask what it means for your daily life if the connection that love created is truly permanent. We will ask what grief teaches us about the nature of consciousness, the nature of love, and the nature of the universe. And we will ask the question that has been implicit in every investigation in this series: if the deepest reality is connection, and if the connection cannot be destroyed by death, then what is death? And what is the love that survives it? We have now traced grief through every layer of evidence available to us. The neuroscience has shown that grief is not an emotion but a neurobiological crisis, the brain's desperate, dopamine-driven search for a person who has been wired into its reward circuitry, its prediction models, and its very sense of identity. The physics of information conservation has shown that the quantum correlations created by a lifetime of shared experience are preserved by unitarity and cannot be destroyed by death. The Penrose-Hameroff model and Bohm's implicate order have provided mechanisms by which consciousness information may survive the dissolution of the brain. The anomalous evidence has suggested that the connection between the living and the dead may be experientially real, and the geometry of emergent spacetime has given us a precise language for understanding grief as a sudden increase in the decoherence barrier between two previously entangled systems, a thickening of the veil between the classical surface and the quantum depth. Now we must bring all of this together and ask what it means for the person who is grieving, for the nature of love, for the nature of death, and for the nature of the universe that contains them both. Let us begin with what we can say with confidence. We can say with confidence that the information constituting a human being is not destroyed at death. This is a consequence of unitarity, the most fundamental law in quantum mechanics, confirmed by the resolution of the black hole information paradox and by every experiment in quantum physics that has ever been performed. The quantum correlations between you and the person you loved are permanent features of the universe's quantum state. They cannot be erased by time, by distance, or by death. This is not a belief. It is physics. We can say with confidence that the brain in grief is not merely sad, it is searching. The nucleus accumbens activation, the addiction withdrawal neurochemistry, the phantom limb architecture, and the interbrain synchrony data all demonstrate that grief is a biologically driven, evolutionarily conserved response to the loss of a connection that the brain has built into its fundamental operating architecture. The brain does not delete the lost person. It maintains their neural representation, sometimes for the rest of the survivor's life. We can say with confidence that the continuing bond between the bereaved and the deceased is not pathological. It is healthy. The research of Dennis Klass and subsequent investigators has overturned the old model of grief that demanded letting go, and has established that the maintenance of an ongoing relationship with the deceased is associated with better long-term adjustment, more meaning, and less depression. And we can say with confidence that every major contemplative tradition has independently developed practices for maintaining the connection between the living and the dead, practices that share the same structure across every major culture: concentrated, loving, sustained attention directed toward the deceased through the bond that the relationship created. Now let us state what the evidence suggests, but has not conclusively proven. The evidence suggests that the quantum correlations preserved by unitarity may have experiential significance, that the preserved entanglement between the living and the dead may be perceivable under conditions of reduced decoherence, such as sleep, meditation, and the heightened emotional states that grief produces. The after-death communication reports, the dream visits, the shared death experiences, and the deathbed visions are consistent with this interpretation. The evidence is not proof, but it is a pattern, a cross-cultural, cross-methodological, statistically significant pattern that the materialist framework has not explained. The evidence suggests that the contemplative practices for maintaining the bond with the deceased may work not merely as psychological coping mechanisms, but as physical interventions in the entanglement structure of reality. The concentrated attention, the emotional depth, the sustained repetition, and the communal amplification that these practices employ are precisely the conditions that would reduce decoherence and enhance the perceivability of preserved quantum correlations. The practices may be doing what they claim to be doing, reaching the dead, transmitting coherent information through the entanglement channel, and maintaining a connection that death has obscured but not destroyed. And the evidence suggests through the convergence of physics, neuroscience, and the contemplative traditions that death may not be the end of the person but the transformation of the person from an explicate, localized, embodied form into an implicate, delocalized, vacuum-encoded form. The person is not gone, they are distributed. Their information has been spread across the quantum vacuum, encoded in the entanglement structure of spacetime, preserved by the laws of physics in a form that is not accessible to the senses but that is, according to the physics, as real and as permanent as anything in the universe. These suggestions are speculative. They push beyond the boundary of confirmed science, but they are not pseudoscience. They are built on established physics, supported by anomalous but statistically significant evidence, and consistent with the deepest insights of every major contemplative tradition. The convergence is too precise and too consistent to be dismissed without serious examination. Now let us explore what this means for the person who is grieving. If the connection that love created is truly preserved by unitarity, then the grief you feel is not evidence that the connection is broken. It is evidence that the connection is still active. The pain of grief is the pain of a bond that is pulling against a barrier, the decoherence barrier that death has imposed between you and the person you loved. The pain is not the pain of absence. It is the pain of presence, the presence of a connection that is still there, still pulling, still reaching across the barrier, but that cannot be perceived through the classical channels that death has closed. This reframing does not diminish the pain. The pain is real. The barrier is real. The inability to see, to hear, to touch the person you loved is real and devastating. But the reframing changes the meaning of the pain. In the materialist framework, the pain of grief is the pain of permanent, irreversible loss. The person is gone. The connection is severed. The pain is the echo of something that no longer exists. In the entanglement framework, the pain of grief is the pain of a connection that persists across a barrier that the senses cannot penetrate. The person is not gone. The connection is not severed. The pain is the signal of something that still exists, something that the senses cannot reach, but that the deeper circuits of the brain can still feel. The difference between these two framings is the difference between despair and hope. In the materialist framing, grief leads to acceptance of permanent loss, the resignation to an absence that will never be filled. In the entanglement framing, grief leads to the recognition that the connection persists in a form that requires a different kind of perception, a perception that is not sensory but attentional, not visual but intuitive, not mediated by photons and sound waves, but by the quantum correlations that the relationship created and that death cannot erase. This is not a trivial distinction. The framing of grief determines the trajectory of grief. If you believe that the person is permanently, irreversibly gone, that the pain you feel is the echo of an absence that will never be filled, then the only path forward is acceptance of permanent diminishment. You learn to live with the whole. You learn to carry the absence. You learn to function around the missing piece. This is the grief that the materialist framework offers, courageous, stoic, and ultimately hopeless. But if you believe not on faith alone, but on the basis of the physics of information conservation and the converging evidence of every contemplative tradition, that the person is transformed rather than destroyed, that the connection persists in a form that death has changed but not ended, then the path forward is different. It is not the acceptance of permanent absence. It is the learning of a new kind of presence, the patient, practice-supported, community-sustained cultivation of the capacity to perceive the connection through the barrier that death has imposed. The grief does not become less painful, but it becomes less hopeless, and the difference between pain with hopelessness and pain with hope is the difference between grief that crushes and grief that transforms. The psychologist Robert Niemeyer, one of the leading researchers in grief psychology, has documented that the single most important factor in healthy grief resolution is meaning-making. The ability of the bereaved to construct a coherent narrative that gives meaning to the loss. Bereaved people who can answer the question why, not in the causal sense, but in the existential sense, the sense of what the loss means within the larger story of their life, show better adjustment than those who cannot. The entanglement framework provides a meaning that no other framework offers. The loss is real, but the connection is permanent. The pain is real, but the love is preserved. The absence is real at the surface, but the presence is real at the depth. And the grief is not the end of the story. It is the chapter in which you learn to perceive what you always had but could always see, and now must learn to feel through a different kind of perception. The contemplative traditions have been teaching this for millennia, and now the physics is arriving at the same conclusion through an entirely different method. In Buddhism, the teaching on grief is not the teaching of letting go. It is the teaching of transforming the nature of the connection. The Tibetan master Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, when asked about the loss of loved ones, replied, "The love you feel for them does not die. The bond is not broken. But the form of the bond must change. You must learn to love them in a new way, not through the eyes and the ears and the hands, but through the heart, through the practice, through the awareness that sees beyond the veil." In the entanglement framework, this teaching is a precise description of what the physics requires. The classical channels have closed. The sensory perception of the deceased is no longer possible, but the quantum channel, the entanglement correlation that the relationship created, is still open. The new way of loving that Dilgo Khyentse describes is the shift from classical to quantum perception, from the sensory channels that death has closed to the entanglement channel that death cannot close. The practice of meditation, of Tonglen, of dedicated merit transfer, is the cultivation of the quantum perception that can detect the preserved correlations through the decoherence barrier. In Christianity, the teaching on grief is anchored in the resurrection. I am the resurrection and the life, Jesus says in the Gospel of John. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. The resurrection is not merely a future event that will occur at the end of time. It is a present reality that is accessible now, through the faith, the prayer, and the sacramental participation that connect the living to the body of Christ, in which the dead are already alive. The Christian who grieves does not grieve as one without hope. They grieve as one who knows that the connection persists, not through the classical channels of sensory perception, but through the sacramental channels of the body of Christ, which is the Christian name for the entanglement structure that connects all members, living and dead, in a single, indivisible communion. Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians, written to a community that was grieving the death of its members, acquire extraordinary significance in the entanglement framework. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. Paul is not saying that Christians should not grieve. He is saying that Christians should not grieve without hope, that the grief of the Christian is different from the grief of the materialist, because the Christian knows that the dead are not gone. They are asleep, present in a different mode of existence, accessible through the communion that the body of Christ maintains, and destined for a resurrection in which the decoherence barrier will be permanently dissolved and the connection that love created will be fully, completely, and eternally restored. The Christian mystic Julian of Norwich, writing from a cell in which she spent decades in contemplative solitude, received a revelation during a severe illness that she believed brought her close to death. In the revelation, she saw the entire cosmos as a hazelnut in the palm of God's hand, small, fragile, and seemingly insignificant, but sustained in existence by the love that created it. And she heard the words that have echoed through 6 centuries of Christian mysticism: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Julian's assurance is not a dismissal of suffering. It is a statement about the ultimate structure of reality. In a universe built from entanglement, sustained by love, and governed by the conservation of information, the suffering of loss is real, but it is not ultimate. The connection persists, the love endures, and the barrier that death imposes is not permanent. It is a feature of the decoherent surface, not of the entangled depth. All shall be well because the entanglement structure of the universe preserves every connection that love creates, and no power, not death, not time, not the dissolution of every physical form can destroy what the fundamental laws of physics are constituted to preserve. In Islam, the teaching on grief balances patience with ongoing connection. The Quran teaches, "And we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger, and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits. But give good tidings to the patient, who when disaster strikes them say, Indeed we belong to God, and indeed to Him we will return." The phrase "Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi rajiun," we belong to God, and to Him we return, is the most commonly recited phrase upon hearing of a death in the Islamic tradition. It frames death not as a destruction but as a return to the source from which the person came, a return to the ground from which they were projected, a return to the divine unity from which the individual form was differentiated. The Islamic teaching does not ask the bereaved to forget the deceased or to sever the bond. It asks them to recognize that the deceased has returned to God, to the Al-Ghaib, the invisible dimension of reality that is more fundamental than the visible world. The deceased is not lost. They are returned. And the connection between the living and the returned is maintained through dua, through charity, through the ongoing relationship that the Islamic tradition insists death does not terminate. The phrase "to Him we return" is, in the entanglement framework, a description of the process by which the deceased's quantum information is redistributed from the explicate to the implicate, from the visible to the invisible, from the localized body to the delocalized vacuum. The return is not a metaphor, it is a physical process. And the destination God, the Al-Ghaib, the invisible ground, is the same destination that the physics describes. The quantum vacuum, the entanglement structure of space-time, the informational ground from which the visible universe is projected. In Hinduism, the teaching on grief is the teaching on the Atman. As a man casts off his worn-out clothes and takes on other new ones, so does the embodied soul cast off its worn-out bodies and enters other new ones. The body is a garment. The Atman, the true self, the consciousness that constitutes the deepest identity of the person, is not the garment, it is the wearer. And the death of the body is not the death of the wearer. It is the changing of clothes, the transformation of the form, not the destruction of the person. The Hindu teaching on grief instructs the bereaved to grieve the body, but not the person. The body is impermanent, and its loss is painful. But the person, the Atman, the consciousness, the identity that was woven into the body but that was never reducible to the body continues. The connection between Atmans is eternal. The love that connected you to the person you lost is a connection between eternal entities. And the grief, while real and while honored by the tradition, is ultimately a misperception, the mistaking of the garment for the wearer, the confusing of the body's absence for the person's absence, the failure to perceive the eternal connection that the temporary dissolution of the body has obscured. The Hindu funeral rite of cremation acquires specific significance in the entanglement framework. The body is burned, releasing the atoms that constituted the physical form back into the atmosphere, the soil, and the water. The ashes are scattered in a sacred river, typically the Ganges. The ritual is not merely the disposal of remains. It is the facilitation of the transition from localized to delocalized, the physical acceleration of the process by which the person's quantum information is redistributed from the concentrated form of the body to the distributed form of the environment. The scattering of ashes in the river is the scattering of quantum information into the entanglement structure of the natural world, returning the information to the ground from which it came, completing the cycle of manifestation and dissolution that the Hindu tradition describes as the rhythm of Brahman's creative activity. The 13-day mourning period of the Hindu tradition, during which the family performs specific rites and recites specific mantras for the benefit of the deceased, serves the same function as the Buddhist 49 days and the Jewish Shloshim, a structured, sustained, community-supported program of concentrated attention directed toward the deceased during the critical transition period. The Garuda Purana provides detailed descriptions of the soul's journey after death and the specific practices that the living should perform at each stage. Practices that assume the channel is open, the attention of the living can reach the consciousness of the dead, and the love that connected them in life continues to operate across the boundary that death has imposed. In Judaism, the structure of mourning is itself a teaching about the geometry of grief. The 7 days of Shiva, the 30 days of Shloshim, the 11 months of Kaddish, and the annual Yarzeit create a temporal architecture that mirrors the physics of decoherence. The most intense mourning Shiva, in which the bereaved sits at home, receives visitors, and refrains from normal activities, occurs during the period when the decoherence is most acute, when the absence is most raw, when the brain's search for the deceased is most intense. The mourning gradually lightens over the following months, as the brain slowly updates its model and the decoherence stabilizes. And the annual Yarzeit provides a permanent, lifelong rhythm of remembrance that maintains the connection indefinitely, a yearly pulse of concentrated attention that keeps the entanglement channel from closing entirely. The genius of the Jewish mourning structure is that it does not ask the bereaved to choose between grief and connection. It provides a framework for both a structured, community-supported process in which the bereaved can fully experience the devastation of the loss, while simultaneously maintaining the bond with the deceased through the daily rhythm of Kaddish, the communal support of the minyan, and the permanent rhythm of annual remembrance. The structure honors the pain while sustaining the connection. It allows the decoherence barrier to stabilize while keeping the entanglement channel from closing. It is, in the entanglement framework, a masterpiece of decoherence management, a technology for navigating the transition from embodied to vacuum-encoded connection without losing the connection in the process. The Talmud records that Rabbi Yochanan, after the death of his study partner Resh Lakish, was inconsolable. Other scholars were sent to comfort him, to engage him in the intellectual debates that had been the heart of his life. But Rabbi Yochanan rejected every substitute. "Are you comparable to Resh Lakish?" he said to each one. "When I stated something, Resh Lakish would raise 24 objections, and I would offer 24 solutions, and the matter would become clear. But you merely prove me right. What use is that?" Rabbi Yochanan's grief was not for a companionship that could be replaced. It was for a specific, irreplaceable, unique entanglement, a quantum correlation between two minds that had been tuned to each other through years of shared intellectual struggle, and that no other mind could replicate. The entanglement was unique because the relationship was unique, and the grief was proportional to the uniqueness, proportional to the irreplaceability of the specific quantum correlations that the specific relationship had created. The structure is not arbitrary. It was developed over millennia of observing the grief process and responding to it with practices that the community found effective. And the structure it follows: intense, concentrated connection in the acute phase, followed by gradual reduction in intensity, followed by permanent, rhythmic maintenance, is precisely the structure that the entanglement framework would prescribe for managing the transition from a localized, embodied bond to a distributed, vacuum-encoded bond. Now we must address the deepest question that this investigation raises. Not the question of whether the connection survives death. We have assembled the evidence for that, and the reader must weigh it for themselves. But the question of what death means, in a universe where the fundamental structure is connection. In every investigation in this series, we have arrived at the same conclusion. The deepest reality is connection. Space is woven from entanglement. Gravity is the geometric expression of entanglement. Love is the conscious experience of entanglement. Distance is an emergent measure of entanglement deficit. Separation is a product of decoherence. And the contemplative traditions, across every major civilization, describe the ultimate nature of reality as unity, the oneness of Brahman, the emptiness of Sunyata, the body of Christ, the Tawhid of Islam, the Ein Sof of Kabbalah. If the deepest reality is connection, then death is not what it appears to be. Death appears to be the ultimate disconnection, the final, irreversible severing of the bond between two conscious beings. But in a universe where connection is fundamental and separation is emergent, death cannot be a severing of connection. It can only be a transformation of connection, a change in the form that the connection takes, a shift from the classical to the quantum, from the explicate to the implicate, from the visible to the invisible. The connection persists, the form changes, and the grief is the experience of the form changing, the agonizing transition from one mode of connection to another, from a connection mediated by the senses to a connection maintained by the deeper structure of reality. In the block universe framework that we explored in our investigation of time, the person you loved exists at every moment of their life, permanently, unchangeably, inscribed in the fabric of space-time. The block universe does not have a past that disappears. Every moment is equally real. The moment you held their hand is not gone. It exists, now, permanently, in the block. The moment you heard their laugh is not gone. It exists. The moment you said goodbye is not gone. It exists. Every moment of your shared life is a permanent feature of the space-time block, as real, as present, and as physically actual as the moment you are experiencing right now. Death, in the block universe, does not destroy the person. It is the boundary of their world line, the edge of the region of space-time in which their physical form existed. But beyond the boundary, the entanglement correlations that their world line created continue to influence the space-time geometry. The gravitational curvature that their mass produced persists after they die. Gravitational waves propagate outward at the speed of light, carrying information about the person's existence indefinitely. And the entanglement correlations that their consciousness produced persist after they die. Quantum correlations propagate through the entanglement structure of the vacuum, carrying information about the person's consciousness indefinitely. The world line has a boundary, the information does not. In the retrocausal framework that we explored in our investigation of the future self, the influence flows in both directions. The deceased's quantum state, preserved in the vacuum, may influence the living not only through the forward time correlations of unitarity, but through the backward time correlations of retrocausality. The deceased may not merely persist in the entanglement structure, they may actively influence the living from within that structure, guiding, nudging, shaping the trajectory of the living through the same retrocausal mechanisms that Wheeler's delayed choice experiment demonstrates. The bereaved person who feels that the deceased is guiding them, who makes a decision, and feels that the deceased is approving, who avoids a danger, and feels that the deceased is protecting, may not be fantasizing. They may be perceiving the retrocausal influence of a consciousness that is preserved in the entanglement structure and that is reaching backward through time to shape the living's trajectory. This is speculative. It must be stated clearly as speculative. But it is consistent with the physics of retrocausality, with the block universe, with the conservation of information, and with the reports of bereaved people across every culture who describe the deceased as an active, guiding, protective presence in their ongoing lives. This is what every contemplative tradition has been saying. Death is not the end, it is a transformation. The person you loved has not been destroyed, they have been transformed from a visible, localized, sensory-accessible presence to an invisible, delocalized, quantum-preserved presence that persists in the entanglement structure of the universe. The transition is painful because the sensory channels that you relied on have closed, but the transition is not final because the quantum channels that you may not even know you have are still open. The Sufi poet Rumi, who wrote from the depths of grief after the disappearance of his beloved Shams of Tabriz, expressed this with an image that condenses the entire investigation. Goodbye is only for those who love with their eyes, because for those who love with the soul, there is no such thing as separation. The eyes are the classical channels, the sensory instruments that operate in the explicate order, in the 5% of the visible universe, in the decoherent surface of macroscopic reality. For those who love with their eyes, death is goodbye. The channels close, the signals stop, the person disappears. The separation is total and final. But the soul is the quantum channel, the consciousness that operates in the implicate order, in the 95% of the invisible universe, in the entanglement structure beneath the decoherent surface. For those who love with the soul, there is no separation. The entanglement persists, the connection endures. The person has not disappeared. They have changed form from the visible to the invisible, from the localized to the delocalized, from the explicate to the implicate, and the soul, which has always been a citizen of both orders, can perceive them still. Rumi's distinction between the eyes and the soul is the distinction between the 5% and the 95%. It is the distinction between the decoherent surface and the entangled depth. It is the distinction between the projection and the code. And it is the distinction that every investigation in this series has been building toward. The visible is real, but it is not the whole. The invisible is vast, but it is not empty. And the connection that love creates bridges both existing simultaneously in the visible and the invisible, in the explicate and the implicate, in the 5% and the 95%, in the surface where the senses operate and the depth where the entanglement endures. The practice that every tradition prescribes is the practice of learning to love with the soul, learning to shift the basis of perception from the classical to the quantum, learning to sense the connection that the senses cannot detect, learning to love in a new way, not through the eyes and the ears and the hands, but through the awareness that sees beyond the veil, through the attention that reaches into the darkness, through the consciousness that recognizes, in the silence beyond all sensory input, the persistent, permanent, unitarity protected presence of the one you loved. This does not eliminate grief. Nothing eliminates grief. Grief is the price of love, and the price is worth paying. But it transforms the meaning of grief from a protest against permanent loss to a navigation of a changed landscape. A landscape in which the person you loved is not gone but transformed, not absent but present in a different way, not lost but relocated to a dimension of reality that your senses cannot reach, but that your consciousness, with practice and with patience, may learn to perceive. Every investigation in this series has pointed toward this conclusion. Time is not what it appears to be. Death is not what it appears to be. Distance is not what it appears to be. Separation is not what it appears to be. And the universe is not what it appears to be. The appearances are real at their own level, but they are not the deepest truth. And the deepest truth, the truth that physics and the contemplative traditions converge upon, when they are pursued with sufficient depth and sufficient honesty, is that the connection is permanent, the love is preserved, and the grief, painful as it is the evidence not that the connection has been broken, but that the connection is still alive, still pulling, still reaching, still binding you to the one you loved across a barrier that is real, but that is not, and never was, final. The universe is built from connection. The connection cannot be destroyed. And the love that you carry for the person you have lost is not a memory of something that is gone. It is the living, active, physically real entanglement between your consciousness and theirs, an entanglement that the laws of physics preserve, that the contemplative traditions honor, and that the grief you feel, in its agonizing, unrelenting, unstoppable pull, confirms. They are not gone. They are entangled with you, permanently, irreversibly, across every barrier that death can build, and the love that tells you so is the most accurate instrument you possess. This investigation began with the most painful experience in human life, the loss of someone you love. It has traveled through the neuroscience of the grieving brain, the physics of information conservation, the geometry of emergent space-time, the anomalous evidence of after-death communication, and the contemplative practices that every major tradition has developed for maintaining the bond between the living and the dead. And it has arrived at a single conclusion that every thread of evidence supports. The connection that love creates is not temporary, it is not fragile, it is not contingent on the survival of the body or the functioning of the brain. It is woven into the entanglement structure of the universe itself, as permanent as the laws of physics, as fundamental as the ground of space-time, as real as anything in the cosmos. The grief you feel is the most human experience there is. It is the experience of a conscious being who has loved deeply enough to suffer profoundly at the disruption of the bond. Honor the grief. It is the measure of the love. But know that the love it measures is not gone. It is preserved. It is permanent. And it is, according to the deepest physics and the oldest wisdom available to the human species, the most indestructible force in the universe. You loved someone. That love changed the quantum state of the universe, and the universe will carry that change forever.